Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that introduction. I think I speak for myself and my colleagues when I say we are so thrilled to be here today talking about patient-oriented research and how you might want to think about engaging patients in your work. Make sure that we're all set up here. First, housekeeping item. On your agendas, we have a bit of a change. The last two presentations by Manoj Lalu and Justin Presso are going to be switched. However, we're still going to be talking about patient-oriented research specifically in the go-kart trial at the very end, okay? So we'll get to go-kart at the very end. It's sort of the grand finale, if you will, okay? Got my notes all set up here. So I'll be talking to you today about the strategy for patient-oriented research, SPOR, as it's commonly referred to. My name is Zarah Monfaredi. I work as a Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research Program Facilitator at the Ottawa Methods Centre, at the Centre for Practice Changing Research. It's a methods support group for the Ontario SPOR Support Unit. And I'm also trained in the CIHR Foundational Curriculum in Patient-Oriented Research, which was done in collaboration with the Centre for Excellence on Partnership with Patients, which is actually based in Montreal. So now that you know who I am, I think you might be itching to know who you're sitting next to, and I know we've already had a bit of a chance to chat. I think it's important to say your name, your stakeholder group, so who you're representing today. Are you maybe wearing a patient's hat? Are you wearing a researcher's hat? Maybe you're a clinician, or maybe you're a policymaker. So your stakeholder group. And then one interesting thing about yourself. So let's try to keep that not related to work. Let's maybe talk about your favorite food, favorite place that you visited, something along those lines, okay? So again, your name, stakeholder group, and favorite place you ever visited. I'll give you 2 minutes at your tables to discuss, okay? I always like that extra, something interesting about yourself that's not related to your work, because I think we tend to think very much in the caps that we're wearing, but we can offer so much more, we can bring so much more, and so that's a really great way to get to know each other. Our agenda today. First, we'll get into what patient-oriented research is, common language, so we'll make sure that we're all speaking the same language, and the history of context of how we got here, and then we'll get into patient engagement, how it works, and some of the benefits of engaging patients in your work. So patient-oriented research, what better place to start in terms of speaking the same language than with the word patient? Depending on the research community that you come from, you might hear a term different from patient. People might prefer to use a different word. So for instance, in the mental health community, you tend to hear people with lived experience quite often. In the arthritis and spinal cord community, you tend to hear consumer quite a bit. And for people who work with senior citizens, you tend to hear client quite a bit. So just shout out what you think of when you hear the word patient, and maybe if you've ever been in that role yourself as a patient or as a caregiver for someone, what did you prefer to be called? Any thoughts on those two?
Impatient.
Impatient. That's an interesting one. That's interesting. So why impatient, would you say?
Because the whole system is directed at the what's good for everybody but the patient.
The patient.
So, which brings me to say, all of you should read the book called The Patient Disease. That's where we should go. And what I'd really like to be called is a member. And I know Kaiser Permanente in the States is now talking about patients, but as members. And I think that's a nice sort of term.
Member, okay, I like that. What thoughts do we have about consumer? So based on that thought of impatient, of being part of the process, do we like the word consumer? Does that evoke feelings of a supply and demand model in healthcare that we'd like to stay away from? Or is that something that we should be transparent about? I'm seeing shaking heads, no. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, speaking from my own experience, I just want to thank you for having us here. But the word patient, I mean, you have to call it something, right? So I have been a patient many times. But we're individuals, and what I found was immediately once you rest in the hospital gown, for example, you take on a different persona.
Right.
And if you are in Canada versus the United States, you also are viewed differently. So one, as in the United States, as a consumer, and hopefully as an individual, although I think it's still, once you put on your gown, you're a patient. But as a consumer, the approach is quite different.
Right.
In Canada, for example. Whereas you're seen more as a cost, and on the American side, revenue.
Right.
So individual, so how do you define patient? I would say I would like to be seen as an individual and not necessarily classified as a patient in a doctor-patient relationship as an individual. And I do like the idea as being thought of as a consumer because I want to be treated like a good consumer.
Right, right. So you bring up a couple of really good points there. So in the States, there's that overt exchange of monies, and so there is that notion of a consumer supply and demand model. The other point you bring up is about putting on the hospital gown. So patient sometimes has a negative connotation associated with it because it insinuates the loss of control, giving up control to a higher power that can tell you what's right and what's wrong, right? So this is why, depending on where you're working, you'll hear different terms. However, in terms of the, sorry, go ahead, yeah. Advisor, you often hear partner as well. These are really good terms. And something that you touched on there was being a caregiver to someone who is normally seen as the patient. So are those people included in our understanding of the word patient? So today, when you hear me referring to patient, I am including individuals with personal experiences of a health concern, but also their caregivers, so informal and formal, including their family and their friends. If throughout the day we'll all be referring to patients, you feel better substituting with another term in your own mind, something that resonates better with you, then feel free to do that, something that resonates with your work maybe. So now that we have an understanding of patient, what about this patient-oriented research thing? So it's defined as a continuum of research that engages patients as partners. It also focuses on patient-identified priorities. It's conducted with multidisciplinary teams, and it aims to apply the knowledge generated to improve the healthcare system and practices. So you might be looking at this list and thinking, hold on, shouldn't all research aim to improve healthcare in some kind of a way? I'm already doing that. Well, yes, absolutely. However, within the context of the strategy for patient-oriented research, we're talking about research that hits on all four of these points, not just one or two, and not a combination of just one or two. Something else that I'd like to bring out of that list is this point in particular, that it focuses on patient-identified priorities in order to improve patient outcomes. So traditionally, there's more of a focus on physical outcomes in both healthcare and research. So things that you can measure with, say, a blood pressure cuff or with lab results, things like that. But outcomes that take into consideration patient values, their preferences, their needs, those are referred to as patient-reported outcomes or patient-centered outcomes. They take into consideration things like quality of life measures, so pain, fatigue, emotional distress, and even social participation, inclusion, and exclusion as well. So to illustrate that point a little bit more, I'll provide an example. Imagine an elderly person that suffers from chronic illness, chronic pain. They'll go to their doctor, and their doctor will prescribe them a painkiller. Well, that's great. They'll go pick up their painkiller, and the upshot of that might be that their pain will be reduced. However, when they go pick up their pain medication from the pharmacist, they'll advise them against driving because it makes them drowsy and fuzzy-headed, and so they shouldn't be behind the wheel of a car. Well, this elderly person could also be a grandparent, and so that means that they can't just jump in their car and drive to visit their grandchildren anymore. So that seriously affects their emotional state, as well as anything else that they typically do in their day, so their participation in clubs and in groups and things like that. So the point is, these patient-centered outcomes have to be weighed along with the physical outcomes, right? Because they both ultimately affect the overall well-being of the patient. But who gets to decide which takes precedence over the other? They're both equally as important, right? So they need to be considered in tandem. And that's what the strategy for patient-oriented research is trying to do. So it's a culture shift that this Canadian initiative is trying to target. It's a federal, provincial, and territorial coalition of partners that are trying to integrate research into care. It's about ensuring that the right patient receives the right intervention at the right time. Now, when I first read that, I honestly thought, That's a little bit ridiculous. Shouldn't every patient be receiving the right intervention every time? So what exactly does that mean, and how seriously are we missing that mark? So does anyone care to venture a guess at filling in these blanks? What percentage of patients are currently receiving treatment that is not of proven effectiveness? And what percentage of patients are getting care that is not needed or potentially harmful? Just shout out some numbers. 74% of patients are not getting treatments of proven effectiveness. And what percentage of patients would you say are getting potentially harmful treatment? You paint a scary picture of healthcare. 74 and 50%. I seriously hope that's not the answer. Does anyone else want to counter that? Maybe a more optimistic view. Right, 10% or less for the potentially harmful?
Yeah.
Right, okay. So that's good, that's our threshold. Okay. Right, so what percentage of the patients not getting? It's difficult. It's difficult to imagine that patients would be in our healthcare system not getting the best treatment, right? And so it's true. You tend to be more on that higher end of the scale. So thankfully, potentially, we're lower than that. However, it's still pretty striking. Half of patients are not getting treatments of proven effectiveness, and a quarter are getting treatments that they don't need or potentially could be harmful to them. Okay? So, yeah.
I don't know where you get these numbers from or how you've done that research or how you're even defining any of these things. So I can't bias or not buy it. I'm agnostic about these numbers until I understand, speaking of research, how you're defining the terms and how you do things.
Right, right. Very good point. That's very difficult to put faces behind, these numbers. And so I'm going to talk in a second about sort of why this could be, but that's the reference there, and I can put up my reference as well at the end if you'd like to do a little bit more delving into this. But it comes from the CIHR research behind SPOR itself. So, I mean, it is pretty striking numbers. And so one of the reasons for that is what they call at CIHR the two death valleys. Genuinely, they're called the two death valleys. So it's the challenges that are presented within knowledge translation. As we move from bench science, on the left there, through to clinical science and knowledge, and then finally into clinical practice, there are certain barriers that researchers need to overcome. And part of the reason for that is that research is not normally very connected to patient outcomes. It's not normally very connected to the overall quality of health care. And one of the reasons for that is because the key stakeholders, the knowledge users, the clinicians, the policymakers, the patients, are not normally at the table. And so SPOR is trying to include all of those voices at the research table to make sure that the research that is conducted at the far left of this scale is in areas where patients feel is needed, is in areas, and it's understandable to the policymakers so that we see that translated into clinical care and practice. A recent view of the literature actually has shown that it takes an average of 17 years for 14% of research evidence to be taken up into clinical practice. So 17 years for just 14%. I think we can all agree that that is both frustrating and very inefficient use of both our time and our resources in terms of money, okay? So again,
That's a number I can love.
yeah, I know. It's a very popular research study, right? Yeah, I know. We've all seen that one. So, and it is, like I say, frustrating. And so part of the ways that we can address that is by making sure that all the relevant stakeholders are at the table when we're discussing research and research priorities. So now we've talked about patient-oriented research. Let's talk about patient engagement in research. Now what I've done here is I've highlighted the meaningful and active part of the definition. So it's a collaboration in research governance, priority setting, conduct, and knowledge translation. And why I've highlighted the meaningful and active is to make a point about tokenism. So hands, who has heard this term tokenism before? Right, okay, perfect, perfect. So tokenism is the false appearance of inclusiveness. All too often, I'm seeing lots of nods, all too often in research, patient engagement, the spirit of patient engagement is lost because essentially their responsibilities are just there to tick a box on the research proposal, right? And so that's what we are aiming not to do. Tokenism is, for instance, asking patients to be part of your research as partners, but ultimately their voice has no impact on the decision-making process. So when conducting research with patient engagement, it's important to make sure that the patient's lived experience is treated with just as much respect and value as anybody else's educational experience at the table. Avoiding tokenism also means being cognizant of cultural differences, also the needs of the disabled populations, maybe language barriers depending on the community that you're working with, and marginalized communities as well. So patient engagement means extending beyond just recruiting patients to be your data, to be the subject or the participant of research, but really involving them at the beginning on the team designing and guiding the research process. Okay? So now we have an idea of patient-oriented research, patient engagement. Let's start thinking about research, but research from the patient's perspective. So we'll run a bit of an activity. I want you to imagine that you've just recruited a patient or someone who has no background in research whatsoever to your research team. And you'd like to explain to them what they're getting themselves into, so what this process looks like. I'd ask that you try to describe the research process from beginning to end in at least 10 stages, at maximum 10 stages, and think about where you start. Do you start it with a research question, or do you start with a data set and then you think, okay, what question can I answer with this data set? And then what are the next steps? And what is your endpoint? When do you know that you've conducted your research project completely and that you're done? And how do you measure success potentially? Okay, so we're gonna run it like a think, pair, share. Don't know if everyone's familiar with that. So it's a think first individually on your own. I'll give you a minute to do that. And then at your tables, you can write out, so you've got paper there and markers. You can write out the process, but first discuss and see if at your tables you sort of thought of research differently. That may be the case. And then we'll come together as a wider group and talk about these similarities and differences in the research process, okay? So I'll give you a minute first of all, and I'll prompt you with time, okay? So in the interest of time, we'll move forward just to my very basic illustration of what research could look like to some people. This obviously will not work for everyone. It will not work for every research design, so that's where more complications come in. But notice that I've illustrated it more like a cycle than a linear process. And so one reason for that is because it is iterative. And like this table said at the front, things come up and potentially you might not need to work backwards and rework a step if something goes wrong. Also, is there really a distinct endpoint, or is it sort of just a continuation of the research cycle that you continually evaluate your outcomes, you continually make sure that you're achieving what you meant to achieve? So think about that and continue thinking about that, because later in the day we'll talk about roles for patients. And so it may be the case that a patient partner won't be able to contribute to every step along the way, but there are certain areas where they will be. And that comes from more than just their lived experience with an illness. That comes from maybe their volunteer experience, maybe their career experience, things like that. They can bring things to the table in other sorts of ways.
They can. I think patients can actually provide input in every single one of those.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, I like that, because typically we get a lot of pushback where people say, well, can they really contribute to analysis? Can they really contribute to data collection? Absolutely. Patients have perspectives. Patients with appropriate training may actually be able to put the pen to the paper and actually do the work. It's all about the patient that you recruit, and every patient will be different. And every group of patients will be different, because really it should be a group of patients, right? So it is really about what works for your process, what works for your research, and who you have to work with. Okay? Yeah.
That too, because I think you bring in, you said it was a patient partner.
Right.
And what I understand about partnership is we're all in this together. So I don't think you get to decide that I'm only your partner for this bit or that bit. I'm either your partner or I'm not your partner. In which case, leave me out.
Right. And so there's different degrees too of participation or of engagement, right? So potentially a patient will definitely need to be informed about the entire process. However, will it be necessary for them to be at every single meeting if the patient says, do you know what, I don't have any background in stats, I don't need to be a part of that? Is it necessary for them to be there? No. But if they choose, well, okay. So these are questions that you'll have to grapple with your research teams. And so your point is very well placed in illustrating how complex the process can be. So yes, absolutely. Just questions that we need to be thinking about. Absolutely. Okay, so lastly, I'll just talk about some benefits. So it does end up leading to better quality research, and obviously, as we already touched on, research that is more in line with the needs and the values of patients, and so therefore it's easier to be disseminated into those communities. Lastly, some international organizations where you may want to turn, some of you have already heard of these potentially. Involve was started in the UK. And PCORI in the States actually came out of the Affordable Care Act, so a little bit contentious at this point, as you can imagine. But really, really good resources to turn to because they have been around a lot longer than our Canadian initiative. So thank you very much for your attention. I know we've gone a little bit over time, but that was really good discussion. Thank you. Any questions, feel free to connect with me offline, and then we do have a bit of a meet and greet later on. So thank you very much.